So if you recall from the beginning of class, we talked about the difference between the professional model of policing and what happened in policing in the late 1800s, early 1900s. So recall that in the professional model of policing, the thing that operated for the majority of the 20th century, one of the primary goals of the police were as crime fighters. This is the first time when we started to call police law enforcement. The idea that they should get off the streets, get into patrol cars, and solve and fight crime. Well, Wilson and Kelling, in their article in Broken Windows, would argue that this style of policing, this professional model where we got police into cars, actually caused them over time to become very detached from the public that they're supposed to be serving. In other words, the big difference, according to them, from riding around with the windows up in a police car than walking around getting in people's faces, not necessarily in a bad way, but being very aggressive and proactive, which is something that kind of gets forced on you when you become a foot patrol. So they argued that this detachment is a problem, and the style of policing that they suggested in Broken Windows, and the style of policing that has developed from the Broken Windows hypothesis, is something that we call now order maintenance policing. So it's a type of policy and strategy that has been evolved and adapted from the kind of Broken Windows model. A lot of people call order maintenance policing Broken Windows policing. You can kind of think of them as fairly interchangeable terms. Now, order maintenance policing, technically speaking, is the absolute most aggressive form of policing that you can have. And I don't mean aggressive in a violent way, but aggressive in terms of the amount of contact and interaction the police officers are having with their public on a daily basis. If you're a police officer and you're not in your car and you're walking around talking to people, you have more contact. You're more aggressive in terms of your awareness and interaction with your community. And according to the order maintenance model, this is what we want. We want police to be much more involved with the public. We want them to be forming relationships with people, and we want them to be aware of a higher number of incidents, no matter how small. Because remember, the idea is that tending to those small incidents is going to improve the community in the long run. So we call it a co-production model, because the idea is the police are not the only people responsible for dealing with and tending to disorder in their communities. That not only is it the police's job, but it's the community's job to form relationships with the police officers in their midst, to get everyone together and try to solve problems together. So, in terms of the range of behaviors that we're expecting police officers to try to conduct and cover in this style, order maintenance policing actually makes police have a much broader function. Remember, they're not just responding to incidents anymore, so the total number of incidents and situations that they could get involved in is a lot higher. And in terms of being in your face, the number of situations that the police can intervene in really greatly increases in this area. Some people have thought of it as being the most pervasive form of policing that we have. And what's pivotal to this model is the use of police discretion, bringing police's ability to make decisions back into the mix. So in the professional model, if you remember back to what August Vollmer was trying to encourage, he was trying to encourage police departments to manage and teach their police officers how to use their discretion wisely. Well, what happened during most of the 20th century is police officers, in terms of their responsibilities and their ideas about what was common practice, it kind of got lost in the mix, and it got very standardized and regimented. And police, if you go through a police officer's kind of book, code book on what he's supposed to do, a lot of times police officers have a lot in their rules about what they're not supposed to do. They don't necessarily have as much in the professional model, teaching them how to adapt and make tough choices in day-to-day situations. So in this new kind of order maintenance model that came out of the Broken Windows thesis, the idea was to encourage police officers to get to the root of problems, be more problem solvers than crime fighters, and teach them that understanding the underlying root of problems in their community is just as important to dealing with the problem than making arrests are. So if order maintenance policing is implemented without this, without discretion, the problem that has come out of that is that it's taken the form of what we call now zero tolerance policing. So zero tolerance policing is sometimes, if you take nothing from this class, one thing that I want you to understand is that the idea of zero tolerance policing, a lot of people say, is based on this broken windows model. It's based on this idea that we should be targeting and tending to disorder. But what I want you to understand in this class is the way that it got implemented, especially in the 1990s, was not the way that the broken windows researchers intended or dreamed that people would take their idea and actually operationalize it. So in New York in the 1990s, there was a police chief in New York City for several years, Chief William Bratton. That name might sound familiar to you guys because he was also the police chief in D.C. for a few years. He's now out in Los Angeles. Very big, very imposing, very authoritative guy. And Bratton, back in the 1990s, remember back to your crime trends information, mid-1990s, that's when we had some of the highest property and violent crime rates in the country, and New York was no exception. So Bratton read the Broken Windows thesis. He read the Broken Windows papers, he talked to Wilson and Kelling, and he came up with this method of utilizing their ideas. And essentially what he did in New York City is he not only tended to disorder, but he enforced an extremely strict enforcement policy on minor offenses. So it's called zero tolerance policing because what he encouraged and what police officers at the time practiced was anytime they saw any offense happening, no matter how minor, an arrest was made. Enforcement of the laws were made. And we now call his version of policing zero tolerance policing. It really grew out of a time period when the New York transit systems reported there being a lot of problems with fare beating, graffiti, pickpocketing, panhandling within the New York subway systems. And when Bratton took over as police chief, he argued that all of those types of small-level disorderly problems really could be linked to kind of one larger problem in his community. So by 1994, when he was police commissioner, he decided that anytime any of these things happen, an arrest is going to be made. And during the 1990s, in the late 1990s especially, after he started implementing this policy, there was a really dramatic crime drop in New York City. Crime dropped by about 35% overall throughout the city. Homicide was even more dramatic. Homicide dropped by about 73% throughout the city. So on its surface, it looked like what Chief Bratton was doing was working. It looked like this zero tolerance policy seemed successful. But what I want you to understand about what they did is this idea of zero tolerance policing is not the same at all as order maintenance policing whatsoever. Because think about what zero tolerance means. Zero tolerance means when a law gets broken, a police officer makes an arrest. No questions, no decisions, no circumstances, etc. So where does discretion fit into that? Where does a police officer's decision-making fit into that model? It really doesn't. You've essentially removed a police officer's decision-making abilities by forcing him to either arrest or not arrest. If a law has been broken, arrest. If it hasn't, you do not. So it kind of took away the whole point of order maintenance policing and the whole point of the professional model, that we should teach police to be good decision-makers. And another thing that's really absent in zero tolerance policing is any role of the community in co-handling and being co-responsible for their problems. If you have a police force that arrests on site when any crime happens without really forming relationships or solving problems with their community, you're not going to really encourage people to form very strong, very meaningful relationships with their local law enforcement. So those are all very obvious problems, but it's also just not possible, if you really think about it, especially in a place like New York City, it's simply not possible to arrest everyone who ever commits a crime, especially public order offenses. If you actually tried to do this, if you actually really tried to do this, you would completely turn police departments and the criminal justice system on their head. The system is not designed to arrest and process everyone that ever commits an offense. So not only are you trying to remove discretion from policing, but you're kind of forcing police officers to make very biased and sometimes very wrong decisions in the face of this kind of blanket policy. And there's a lot of risks of having police have this kind of blanket authority in a community. So think for a few minutes about what some potential risks and possible drawbacks and harms might come from having a police force that encourages and is run under a zero tolerance policy? Well, there are a couple things that we could talk about, but probably the one that's gotten the most attention in terms of concern and testing from research is the loss of police legitimacy within their communities. A researcher named Larry Sherman in the early 90s did several studies looking at how, once these kinds of policing tactics get employed, um, what citizens' opinions and confidence in the police, how that changes over time. And essentially what he found is when police really have an over-reliance on use of force, on coercion, on arrest, this causes people to lose a lot of respect for the police and actually become much less inclined to comply with laws. So by police really forcing very strict, very by the book arrest in all occasions kind of behavior, you're not really encouraging them to form any kind of community bonds and relationships with people around them. And not only is that a problem in terms of losing respect for the people that are policing you, but we know that it makes people worse. It makes people become more likely to rebel and be less inclined to comply with laws. So that's one problem. The loss of police legitimacy, I think, is a very big problem with policing disorder. Even if you're trying to do it right, the idea of policing disorder and tending to the small things can sometimes rub communities the wrong way, especially if it's done in an excessive, extremely forceful way. And another risk with policing disorder is, despite people's best intentions maybe and best efforts, we do not police disorder equally. And it's very difficult, and people often toe the line in their use of police force with disorderly behavior, confusing disorderly behavior and policing it with undesirable groups. So one of the problems, if you're a police department that's encouraging your police officers to target disorderly behavior and form community relationships, well, there might be some members of the community who don't like an undesirable group in their community and communicate that with the police and have the police try to do something about them. So you're really starting to infringe on people's fundamental liberties if you start aggressively enforcing laws only against certain types of people in the community, even if you have the backing of a large amount of community members. So one of the risks and one of the problems with this strategy of policing disorder is people tend to let things like skin color, national origin, or kind of more harmless mannerisms become the basis for distinguishing who's undesirable and who is desirable. In other words, when you're talking about public order crimes, you're towing the line between things that are legal and things that are not, a lot of the times. And one of the problems with giving police a lot of power and authority to police public order offenses is you want them to do it equally to all groups. And if they only start to target particular groups of people, that's when you start having excessive amounts of bigotry and problems that you don't want the police to make any worse within a neighborhood. So yes, again, the idea being, yes, we want police to police disorderly problems, but we also want to maintain our fundamental liberties, to have freedom within our community, to have privacy, to do things that maybe some people don't like, but there's nothing illegal or wrong with. And you don't want police to get to the point where they're just policing anything that they decide is disorderly. So people that have tried to test order maintenance policing and this idea of policing disorder have done it in a couple different places. Some of the first people to do it, well, I don't know about the first people, but George Kelling in New York City went back in and looked at the New York City crime data in the 1990s to try to determine whether or not this order maintenance policing was actually what was causing a reduction in violent crime. In other words, we know order maintenance policing was happening, we know that crime was dropping, but can we actually show that those two things are related, that one caused or influenced the other? And what they showed is, using research with the NYPD, is that these order maintenance activities did seem like they had an impact, that when you tried to control for a number of other things that could be causing a reduction in violent crime, the introduction of order maintenance activities did seem like it had some effect. Similarly, in 2002, a criminologist named Worrell looked at some California counties and found that when police departments within counties in California implemented order maintenance activities, property crimes seemed like they went down. Not necessarily violent crimes, they noted. Violent crimes didn't seem to be affected at all. So that's a little different from what happened in New York City. But some types of crimes did seem like they went down when these kind of order maintenance, tending to disorder types of policing were implemented. And then in Oakland, California in the 1990s, they examined the use of order maintenance policing by the police department there and found that, disorder, one of the things that you would hope, policing disorder went down, but also some of the drug problems and kind of the open air drug markets in Oakland, California were alleviated and were reduced a bit by tending to disorder. So there are some positive outcomes that have come out of this model of policing that encourage many people to try to adopt it in the future. But there are also some very important concerns to think about in terms of broken windows policing. A criminologist named Taylor in 2006 really summed up kind of some of the biggest concerns that we should just keep aware of before we move, nationally in terms of nationally, before we move forward with some big sweeping policy to change how all police departments do business. So one of the things he talked about was the fact that when a police department implements something called order maintenance policing, or if they have a broken windows policing policy that they're going to try to adopt, or even a zero tolerance policy, that's not the only thing they're doing, right? When a police department adopts some new strategy, they're still doing a bunch of other different things. They still have other task forces. They still have people that are walking their beats as normal. So when crime goes down in a community that has implemented a program like that, it's very difficult to tell which program within their department actually caused the change. So Taylor kind of described it as police departments are really using a stew of different programs at any given time. They're kind of constantly starting new initiatives, stopping old ones, and it's very difficult to tell when crime goes down which of the programs actually makes a difference. He also raises some theoretical concerns to think about. One of the biggest ones being, are we really sure as academics, as the public, as law enforcement, what actually constitutes disorderly behavior? I gave you Wilson and Kelling's list of disorderly behaviors, but do we really have a definitive list? What about the things that some people think are disorderly, some aren't? Things that in some places are illegal, in some places aren't. Is that going to be a problem moving forward with a policing strategy that's targeting disorder, when this word disorder kind of refers to a really huge amount of different types of behaviors with often really varying levels of severity? And, how much can disorder and should it vary by a community? Again, this idea that not every community responds to and reacts to signs of disorder in the same ways. Some communities can function and operate and remain in control with fairly high levels of disorder. So if you implement some kind of a blanket policing strategy to target disorder without taking into account the fact that communities really differ on how well they can tolerate it, you might be using resources where they're not needed and not using enough resources where they're needed the most. And finally, he talks about this problem of interpreting broken windows as a zero tolerance form of policing. Yes, we are supposed to be dealing with the little things in broken windows. We're supposed to be tending to disorder, but tending doesn't mean always making arrests. Sometimes a good decision by a police officer can be to not arrest someone, even if they have committed a crime. That's a hard thing for people to wrap their brains around, but for him, according to Taylor, this is a critical element that if we're going to move forward with this, we need to adopt. Because if we want to have this continue to be a co-production model, if we want the community involved at all in what goes on within it, and if we want the community to assume any responsibility for the behaviors that go on within it, you can't just rely on the police to make arrests. You have to encourage police and community members to form relationships to target problems together. Because if community members think that if something goes wrong, the police are just going to make an arrest, why should I worry about it? According to Taylor, that goes completely against the broken windows strategy and theory that Wilson and Kelling suggested so many years ago. So in your discussion for this week, I'm going to have you talk about zero tolerance policing. When police make arrests for extremely minor offenses, things like vagrancy, public drunkenness, why do they do it? Think about that. Why do police do that? Do they do it to protect the public from those people causing harm? Do they do it to remove undesirable persons from the neighborhood? And if it's the latter, if police primarily do that to remove people that many feel are undesirable, who gets to decide what kind of people are allowed to be in public spaces in a neighborhood? Is it the residents? If it's the residents, what are the dangers in that? What are the dangers in relying on residents of a community's ability to make decisions on who should and should not be allowed to take up public space within their community? And if it's the police, if the police should be the ones to decide, what are the dangers with that? What are the dangers with relying on a law enforcement body to make decisions about community members and their presence in an area? So, in this zero tolerance model of policing, which again, we're talking about it because it was employed in New York City in the 1990s, police were operating under a policy of making arrests for all violations of any criminal law. People in a lot of sitcoms and a lot of comedies and TV shows from the 1990s in New York City kind of joke about the fact that Giuliani and Bratton shipped the homeless people out of New York. Well, they didn't ship them out, but they did arrest a lot of them and deal with them within the criminal justice system. So the idea that was set forth in New York City at the time was even the smallest crimes, turnstile jumping, squeegeeing, vagrancy, resulted in arrests. And what I want you to talk about in discussion is when police focus on disorder and operate under this kind of a zero tolerance policy, what harms might it cause? Is zero tolerance policing even possible? And do you guys think that the benefits of it outweigh potential costs? So I just have some stuff. Sorry about that, slight technical difficulty. But in your discussion for this week, again, you're going to be talking about this zero tolerance policing. Is it a good thing? What are some of the risks? What are some of the potential problems for it? And I just wanted to give you some very basic crime data from New York City to take a look at over the time period that we're concerned about. So if you look at these three series of graphs, they're all showing different types of crime. You don't have to worry too much about the differences between all of these, but the basic trend in all of them is what I wanted to show you, and the fact that the basic trend in all of them is fairly similar, in that starting at about 1992, 1993, 94-ish, really starting in 1994, when Chief Bratton started implementing these policies, one of the suggestions is, if you look at that point on, which is why I put the yellow line to show the cutoff, crime went really dramatically down in New York City. And one of the arguments for zero tolerance policing is this evidence, is the fact that when it got implemented in one of the biggest, most crime-ridden cities in the country, crime went down. And I also want you to look at this graph. So what this graph is showing you is New York City as a whole, which is the pink line with squares in it, compared to other major cities throughout the United States during the same time period and a little bit before. And what you should notice from that is, yes, crime in New York City went down. It went way down, starting in about 92, 93. It also went down in LA, it went down in Chicago, it went down in San Francisco, and crime overall in the United States went down. San Francisco, LA, and Chicago were not implementing zero tolerance policing policies. It was just New York City at the time. So one of the things to think about is, yes, crime went down in New York City, but are you really sure it's because of this policy that got implemented? What are some other potential reasons why crime could have gone down? Okay, so that's all for today. Next week we're going to talk about prisoner reentry. We're going to kind of get back to what we watched in Omar and Pete and talk about kind of disadvantage that impacts communities with incarceration. Don't forget about your papers, because the next time I see you in person, you will be giving me your research papers. So it says papers due next Thursday. That means this upcoming Thursday, the 3rd of May.